Welcome to Plot Recon, where thrillers get tactical. I'm your host, Evan Graver. Today, we're stepping into the world of modern war fiction with Tom Marshall, the author of Close and Destroy. Tom's writing draws on a lifetime of professional experience. He started with the Merchant Marines, served as an Army officer, and worked as a private security contractor. He is currently the director of communications for Staccato and writes about the firearms industry. His debut novel, Close and Destroy, follows a private military company struggling to extract clients from a collapsing nation state, blending battlefield authenticity with the geopolitical tension of today's asymmetric wars. Tom brings his understanding of the contractor mindset to his writing and gives us a fascinating glimpse behind the scenes. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's your debut novel, and you spend a lot of time in the firearms industry and the tactical world writing about this stuff. So, what made you decide to jump into the world of fiction?
The funny thing is I've actually been writing fiction much longer than I've been writing professionally. I think my mom would probably tell everybody that I wrote my first screenplay between the summer between kindergarten and first grade. So wrote screenplays for a while because when I was much smaller, I thought that was the direction I wanted to go in. And that I wound up not going in that direction, but probably sometime around middle school, I switched over to kind of more short form fiction. At the time I was reading, I started getting into some of the thriller series format franchises that, I'm sure all of us know now, Clancy and Ludlum and those guys. And like I said, I really picked that up kind of middle school into high school. So I started writing that and I never got published anywhere. It was kind of just something I was doing on the side for, personal gratification. Eventually, I started writing professionally for magazines. I started out with Guns and Ammo. As a freelance writer in that industry, I wound up writing for a handful of other magazines: SWAT, World of Firepower, Recoil, a few others. And then eventually actually got picked up by Recoil as a staff editor. And I was there for 7 years before I left there and went to Staccato. But I was writing fiction kind of again on the side, just for my own, just for me, for a long time. And then finally got something down on paper that was of a commercially viable length, because most of what I had been doing over the years was kind of more short story. I didn't have anything that was sort of like, again, commercially viable, like a novel length manuscript. So when I did finally get something that long produced, I went into discussions with my colleagues at Recoil. In fact, their parent publisher is the ones who published Close and Destroy.
I was just going to ask you about that. So, Caribou Media Group published your book. Are they known outside of the magazine industry? Are they known for publishing books?
They are known for publishing books. In fact, part of what I did my last year or so working there at Caribou was I helped with their books division. But what they're known for really is nonfiction. So if you were familiar with John Norris, we published his memoirs. There were a couple others, but most of the book publishing that Caribou does is like technical manual type stuff. Gunsmithing books, Book of the AR-15 type, Book of the 1911 kind of titles, right? Things that were really just more on the technical side. I believe Close and Destroy is actually their first foray into commercial fiction publishing. So it was an interesting process for me and for them. We kind of both were learning along the way, but they were super, super collaborative with me. And it really turned out to be a amicable process for both sides.
So, are they putting the book out wide, or are they concentrated in Amazon, or doing a lot of advertising for you, or are you picking that up yourself?
So they're focused primarily on Amazon. I've got paperback, Audible, and Kindle ebook. We're doing some advertising. In the beginning, we didn't. Caribou's properties, again, the magazines that Caribou publishes, you guys, I'm sure, are probably familiar with at least a couple of them: Recoil, Recoil Off Grid, Gun Digest, Blade Magazine, Carnivore, and Concealment. So all of those magazines, the themes and the subject matter, right? Firearms, tactical type stuff, of most mainstream advertising doesn't want to play with that market, right? So things like Google ads and meta ads, it can be really difficult for a brand that specializes in firearms and tactical stuff to be able to kind of really get purchase in the advertising realm. So again, even for them, a lot of that campaign's been kind of grassroots. So we haven't done a ton of, I would say, like traditional advertising. We've been able to do some stuff on social media that has worked well, utilizing several of the magazine properties. Obviously, we've leveraged those magazines in terms of house ads and print exposure that way. We published a couple of excerpts of the book, and then I also wrote some like behind the scenes type content, specifically about some of the gear and the tactics that were used in the book. And I again wrote kind of like a, hey, here's a real life counterpart. And we ran those as magazine articles, and that content was a lot of fun to produce. It's something that, it would be really cool to continue to go down that road. I'd love to see other writers be able to find a place for that, whether it's social media or YouTube. But if you look at things, franchises like John Wick, right? Like everybody's probably seen the YouTube shorts of Keanu Reeves and Holly Berry training with at Terran Tactical's ranch in California, and that content really has gained like a lot of traction to the point where people are so interested in the work that the actors are putting in that the behind the BTS stuff kind of grew legs of its own. So given my actual real world experience, I guess you could call it advertising, but or content based advertising, right? Where I was able to say, look, like if you read the book or you're familiar with the book, here's some of the gear, here's some of the tactics, some of the nomenclature, here's some of the reality that I experienced when I was actually doing not any of the things you actually read about in the book, but when I was in that community, at least. I wanted to really bring that out as sort of a bonus, or I guess a way of advertising, of continuing to tell that story. So that's been a lot of what we've been focused on.
Okay. I noticed when I was looking at Amazon on your book, it says that Rick Prado was a co-author.
Rick wrote the foreword for me. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, he's. I just listened to his book not too long ago, Black Ops: The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior. Amazing guy, amazing career. So I can you tell us a little bit more about Rick? Because he's one of those guys where you just want to sit down and listen to his stories all day long and hear what he has to say and be able to translate it into some sort of action on your page.
Rick is great people. He's a great American, and I certainly not only privileged to know him, but to have him make the effort to support me in my own book journey. When he was, I mean, he's a New York Times bestseller, and I don't know all of what else is in the works for him, but I'm sure there's a lot. I know he's been doing a lot of podcasts and public appearances, and I'm so happy that he has been able to tell that story and has been able to do some of the outreach that he has. I actually got in touch with him for his book. I interviewed him. I was still working at Recoil magazine at the time, and so I interviewed him for Recoil. We have a sort of a section in the magazine where we do spotlights of people. Sometimes it's from the firearms industry, and sometimes it's people who are maybe significant to sort of veteran military history type stuff. So that's where I got in touch with Rick first, was for that. And we have a little bit of overlap in our background, in terms of uh, professional associations. And so, like I said, very very fortunate to call him a friend, and very very fortunate to have him supporting Close and Destroy. Um, but it's he's also, I've been fortunate to be able to kind of give back to him and to his community, not just through interviewing him and through promoting Black Ops through Recoil, but also Rick was the one that introduced me to Billy Waugh. And if anybody out there's familiar or not familiar with that name, Billy Waugh is a legend, and I don't hesitate to use that word. He is a legend in the special operations and intelligence community. And I was very, very fortunate through Rick and some efforts that he and I made to be able to interview Billy Waugh on video for Recoil TV. And Billy passed away probably about 6 months after I interviewed him. So I believe that I had the last on camera sit down appearance with him that he ever made, and was just probably one of my proudest professional moments for sure. So I think Rick has a very strong sense of community when it comes to wanting to storytell. For some of these guys who, throughout their careers, it gets really bludgeoned into you about staying out of the spotlight and the quiet professional mentality and all of that stuff. And that's absolutely necessary and should be respected. But for the men and women in that community who are able to move into a position where that they can tell their stories, it's been really fantastic to work with Rick on one or two projects like that.
So, how much of that translated into your own work? Being able to tell stories of, was there any real life crossover from into your work, into your book?
I would certainly say that it's been an influence, not only my personal experience through my career, but yeah, absolutely getting to sit down, with guys like Rick and Billy. And I was also fortunate enough to interview Norm Hooten, uh, who was, involved in the Battle of Mogadishu. And there's been a couple other guys along the way that I've been very, very fortunate to interact with or interview or to get exposed to, and for sure, some of those things, some of their influence absolutely carries over to the book. I would never want to be in a position where I take somebody else's, you know, war story and, you know, make it my own in a fictional sense. Um, not one for one for sure,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, absolutely getting to work with those guys and interact with them and hear their stories. I would say probably for sure added some flavor to my own work.
So, when how much of this crossover from your journalism is it? How different is the writing from journalism to a long form fiction book? Is it? Did you have trouble crossing over, or was it just sticking some thoughts and emotions onto the page?
I don't think it was difficult to cross over. Like I said, I've been kind of at least under the table working on fiction a lot longer than I'd been writing magazine articles. I think magazine articles are easier for a couple of reasons. One, they're shorter, right? Just
Yeah.
by the very nature, they're shorter, but also because they are most of the type of magazine articles I wrote were either gear reviews or they were educational in the sense of covering specific techniques. So there was a little while where I was lead editor for Recoil's sister publication Off Grid, which was more of like a preparedness and like disaster response survival type magazine. So that magazine, the articles were very doctrine heavy or maybe more like educational in terms of like actual skills and techniques than they were always gear reviews. Either way, it was writing about a technical subject that I knew a lot about or was also very familiar with, or a product that I had been able to spend, you know, weeks or months examining and testing and kind of formulating my thoughts. And then I can just condense all that down into a, typically 18 to 2,500 word article. And that's, like I said, that's pretty, you can, it's pretty, I don't want to say formulaic, but in terms of how I can approach it, my approach is much more structured to a magazine article than it has ever been to fiction. Some people I know they outline their fiction. I don't. That's just never worked for me. If anybody who's ever worked in like video production, I would say that I have a shot list. I have a list of bullet points of hey,
Mhm.
here are sort of the major things that have to happen. And frankly, sometimes even that shot list is not in chronological order, and I got to cut and paste stuff in that document as I go. I would say that my writing method for fiction is probably a little more chaotic. I could use the word organic. It's a little more free form, but it's certainly less structured than how I approach writing a magazine article or a product review.
So a lot of times we call ourselves pantsers because we're writing by the seat of our pants, and the characters just kind of take over the page and talk to us and let us know what's going on. Is that how you find your writing?
Absolutely. There are some scenes and some events that made it into the final version of Close and Destroy that I did not intend to happen when I sat down and started writing. And it sounds like absolute insanity to try and explain the concept that the imaginary people that I make up in my head do things that I did not expect them to do. Like that, to say that out loud sounds nuts, for lack of a more elegant term. But I think anybody who's ever written fiction or who's ever really kind of immersed themselves in character driven storytelling of any kind, especially long form, right? I think I think that's part of the process. And there's a part of me that really, like the rational side of my brain, really yearns to be able to sort of explain that neurologically, right? Again, to go back to that, how, I am single handedly deciding everything that happens in this story. How is it that any of it can surprise me? But it does. And I think that that is the magic, again, for lack of a better term. I think that's the magic of storytelling. I think that's the magic of immersive fiction, is that there's just there's this part of the process that is maybe like a little bit inexplicable. There's a part of the process where everybody gets surprised, even the creator, whether that's a yeah, and I would suspect that this probably applies to other art forms too, right? Screenplay writing, painting, music. I'm sure that there are probably parts of all of these types of artistic pursuits where things just take a twist and a turn, and it can be weird to try and explain how, like, as the creator, how did I not, what do you, how did I not see that coming? How did I not make a conscious decision for that thing to happen? But I would agree. That's absolutely an experience that I've had repeatedly.
Well, I wouldn't. It's an experience that I think most authors have along the way as they start out the book. They don't really know, or maybe not completely understand the character and how he operates. But as you continue to write, that character grows in your mind. He grows on the page, and they just starts taking over. Sometimes I equate it just to like somebody's beaming something in from the fifth dimension, that when it's like your fingers are just typing the words that are coming in, and it can leave you exhausted at the end of the day because you're living multiple personalities on the page, and then trying to come back to your own self and be yourself around everybody else. Sometimes it's just completely exhausting.
Absolutely. And I took an approach with Close and Destroy that I wanted to have more of an ensemble cast. And that's certainly not to knock any work out there that maybe is like more lone hero focused, right?
Hmm.
I read those things. I love those things, from, take your pick, or James Bond, Batman, whoever, right? Any myriad of characters out there. That kind of storytelling is great. And like I said, I consume the heck out of it for sure. But for Close and Destroy, I wanted to take a stab at more of an ensemble cast. So to your point of living like multiple personalities, to your point of it being exhausting, yeah, because it's not just your one main guy and his sidekick, or your one main guy and his love interest or her love interest, or their one or two like support people. When you're talking about 6, 8, main characters, and you're constantly flipping perspectives between them, yeah, it absolutely it gets exhausting,
Yeah. And then you add in, you got your core characters, and you have to make sure that they stay true to who they are with their personality. And then you're bringing in the bad guy and writing the bad guy, and he has to stay true to who he is. Are you finding that bad guys might be a little easier to write because you can let that side of yourself shine?
Yes, I have found that bad guys, my primary antagonist, I have absolutely found that he's been easier to write, much to my chagrin. Honestly, I think everybody really wants to live in the hero, right? Live on the
Hmm.
white knight side of things. But I also think that there are rules and conventions that good guys have to live by. And I mean, that's true in real life with law
Hmm.
enforcement and military, right? There's rules and legalities and ethics of conflict and things like that. There's conventions and laws of war, and that's true. I mean, there are confines in which, in order to be able to look ourselves in the mirror, that we're people that the community is very, very serious, right? That career field, armed responders of any flavor, right? That are absolutely non-negotiable from a ethical or leadership standpoint. And bad guys, both in real life and in fiction, they're not constrained by that. So I have definitely found my villain, for lack of a better term, I think my villain is, I have found him, frankly, to be a little more complex, which I would agree makes it, in some ways makes it more freeing to write, because they can do, especially fictional bad guys, can really do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. It is a it is an interesting exercise because you get to free yourself from the constraints of society and let that part of your brain run wild on the page where we've lived this, lived by the UCMJ and the Constitution and all this stuff, and then you can just go hog wild on the page and be free of all that. And so it's definitely it's so complex when you start to write these characters because it's all the personalities and trying to blend it all together. Are you writing first person? Are you writing, obviously you're with an ensemble cast, you're jumping around in third person. Do you think in first person when you're writing your protagonist?
We don't. And I'm sure that you have gotten the question that I've gotten, which is, somebody looks at your work, right? They read a book, they read your book, and they go, "Well, okay, which one is you?" I don't know if you've gotten that. I've definitely gotten that a
Yeah.
couple times. Oh, well,
Yep.
which character is you? My answer to that question is all of them and none of them,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it would be impossible to create characters in my own mind that aren't shaded by my personality, my values, my philosophies and viewpoints on things. I try really hard to not think first person, and I think I'm at a point now where I don't really struggle with it, but I try really hard not to think in first person when I'm writing, because I also don't want to make that emotional attachment or that psychological attachment, because they're not me, right?
Mm-hmm.
In most ways, the professional careers and escapades of my characters are way more exciting and way cooler than anything I ever did in real life, right? So I don't want the fiction to stray into anything that even remotely runs the risk of self-aggrandizing, right? And that's not to say that people who think in the first person when they write, I'm not saying that that's the motive for anybody else either. Just for me personally, I find like I really want the characters to be their own people. I don't want to think of them as mirrors of me. Again, I'm sure in some respects that's unavoidable, and that is true.
Yeah.
With an ensemble cast, what I'd like to think is, like I said earlier, like my answer to like which one is me is all of them and none of them. I'm sure that like my personality traits and values and approaches to things are sort of probably spread out among the cast, right? But I don't ever, for me personally, I don't ever want any single character to be a one for one. So I try really hard to, well, it's not me doing that thing. It's that character. So what would
Right. I do have a series where I write strictly in first person. Everything is from his perspective, and I find it more difficult to write than being able to hop around from good guy to bad guy and adding multiple perspectives into the story because everything is from the first person perspective straight through your eyes like he's living it and you're reading about it. But then you also have to say this guy is infinitely more cooler than I'll ever be. So I have to write that part of it too, and I feel like that character is sometimes closer to who I actually am than any of my third person characters.
Well, so let me ask you, if because I've done some short fiction type stuff again on my own that's never been published. I've written through first person, just dabbling in storytelling, right? And I can absolutely see how writing from first person is much more challenging for a couple of reasons. One, because it limits, like you said, you can't bounce perspectives. You
Mm-hmm.
can't, if you're truly telling the entire story, you're writing purely from first person, then you can't cut to a scene where the bad guy is in his lair waxing poetic about why he's doing the things he's doing, or where you can reveal what the grand scheme is, right? So I could see where it would be a challenge in being very limited, or limiting, excuse me, in what you're allowed to tell. But my question is, when you're writing your protagonist in first person, are you dropping into that person, or is that person dropping into who you are as you tell the story?
I think it's both because you end up writing it, you end up being in that mindset of that character and having to live in that mindset the entire time you're writing. And then you put it down and go away and do something else. And then you come back and you have to pick that up again. And you have to stay true to who the character is. Like the character might do something that I would never do, but you have to stay true to who he is. It's a difficult thing to do because I don't know. I find it, like I said, exhausting to do sometimes because you're trying to focus completely on how this person sees this thing. You may have the whole story laid out in your head, but it's not how your character sees it and how he comes about to see it. You have to lay out how is this character going to, figure out who the bad guy is. How is he going to figure out the plan? Who's he going to talk to? How is, you have to lay out all this stuff, and then you have to layer in that character's emotions, the character's rationalization, how he sees things, and it may not be the way that you would see things. So it's you're I find that you have to drop in and out of both of the characters and the mindset. And I think that as we write fiction, we pick up personality traits of our characters. Maybe we might not have been so bold to say something, if somebody was, like I say, bully was picking on somebody, and we may not have said something 2 years ago, but we've written a story and wrapped ourselves around this antagonist, protagonist of standing up and taking care of this stuff, and then suddenly you're put back in that situation, and you're the guy standing up and protecting the from the bully, and it's it's kind of a weird transition for the writer, I think.
I definitely think that there's a like a feedback loop that happens there where, again, like you said, I think there's potential for a little bit of that to go back and forth both ways. You make a really good point about first person writing having to switch back and forth between being an omnipotent author and then being a very limited in knowledge character. Again, for me, writing third person and writing third person with a rather large ish ensemble cast, I tend to look at everything top down.
Hmm.
I can architecture the story top down, and then it's always my perspective. Excuse me, it's always my goal when I'm writing to. I like the ensemble cast because I can story tell from a campaign level perspective, to use a military term, right? I can show you, two of the good guys are up here on the map, but another three are down here. And I can tell those stories independently. And then as the book progresses, I can sort of close those two, A and B stories together. And then, oh, now all the good guys unite, and and they can either continue to move on together, or they can, dip in and out of each other's individual operations, missions, whatever. But again, I can story tell from like a campaign perspective. Whereas again, I give you an incredible amount of props for you know ch- choosing slash enduring first person storytelling, because it does so narrowly confine what you're able, not only what you're able to divulge along the way, but sort of how fast you can kind of develop things, right? You can only develop at the sort of at the pace of real time, I would imagine, plus or minus. Whereas
Yeah.
again, if I'm sort of simultaneously telling multiple stories of either multiple individuals or multiple groups of individuals that are like spread across a geographic area or spread across time, I can really inject either plot development or character development probably at like a much larger volume per page or whatever however you want to sort of try and quantify that.
Yeah, because you can take you can develop the characters. Say you're anybody in your ensemble cast, you can have a chapter dedicated solely to them and how they developed, how they came into this situation. Um, Whereas if you're in a first person writing, you either the character has to learn that in some way and then convey that to the reader, or it's I think it's very much easier to write in third person, um, because I've read books where the main character is in first person and they hop to third person for the other members of the cast, and I find it very weird, very off putting. But that's for me as a reader. But so I don't try to write like that. I want to either be third person or all first. But I have a fourth book in that first person series, and I've picked it up and put it down multiple times over the last year trying to write it. And I get partway through it, and I'm like, how do I get from A to B, and how do I wrap this story up? So it's whereas I can sit down and write a third person book in 3 months, and because it's easier to okay, I need a filler chapter here. I can bring this character in from XYZ and a little backstory and bring them in. I think it's easier just to write in third person. It's just write it in third and be done with it. But
I agree, and I've also seen what you referenced in terms of there's kind of a hybrid version of that, right? Where you're, like you said, you're telling the main character's perspective, all first person, but then you're jumping out of that and bringing in other elements third person when you're not focused on your main protagonist. And I definitely see, I absolutely see where that would be off putting, or it's certainly it's an interesting workaround from a
yeah,
from a storytelling perspective that allows you to arguably get the best of both worlds,
yeah,
right? And maybe it gives you a novel experience as a reader where you're watching your main character sort of maybe even kind of fumble through a series of events because his perspective is so limited, while you as a reader also get to maintain you get to the luxury of the omnipotence, right?
yeah,
Because you're
yeah.
getting other perspectives in third person. But yeah, pure first person storytelling. Like I said, I'll be honest, I dabbled in it once or twice on my own. Again, just unpublished. I deployed to Afghanistan as a contractor, sitting in my room with nothing to do. And I worked on a fiction a lot, deployed. And some of that material got repurposed, and names were changed and locations were changed. And some of it did sort of leak into Close and Destroy. But I mean, I have mountains of stuff that'll frankly probably never see the light of day. Some of it pure first person. And like I said, I give you an immense amount of credit for actually maintaining a series from a pure first person, because the
It's
challenges are not insignificant.
it is tough, but I want to circle back around to something I said in the intro. What made you join the Merchant Marines?
So there's a very simple answer to that. And the answer is that what I really wanted to do was, when I was a teenager, what I really wanted to do is my dream was going to the US Naval Academy at Annapolis. And the answer is I didn't get in. So yeah, that's the short answer. Maybe the longer version is that in order to get into a service academy, you have to be nominated by a senator or a congressperson. In my case, it was my local congressperson where I grew up, and I didn't have any kind of relationship with that person. It was actually one of their staff members, and they hold boards and interviews throughout the year for that kind of stuff. So it's not really necessarily a case of having like a connected family or anything. I just sat for an interview. But when I was interviewing with that staffer, they took an extra couple minutes that wound up being pivotal for me, which is to say that at the end of my interview, they said, "Hey, you put down on your application that you want to go to the Naval Academy. Have you considered the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy?" To which my answer was, "What's that?" And to this day, when I tell people I went to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, I still get a lot of like, "Oh, wow, that's really cool. What's that?" I believe it's the smallest service academy. It's either Merchant Marine or Coast Guard Academy is the smallest one. I think it's us. But it is a U.S. Federal Service Academy, just like West Point or Annapolis. You do still have to go through that same nomination process and selection process, and it's identical for the most part. There are some unique things in the Merchant Marine Academy experience that other service academies don't have. At least when I went there, it was a requirement that every cadet, every midshipman had to spend a year at sea working on active U.S. flag merchant ships before they graduated, because it was a graduation requirement for the academy was that you had to sit for and pass either your third mate's exam or your third assistant engineer's exam. And in order to sit for the exam, you had to have, I think it was 330 days of OJT, right, of on hands
Mhm.
time at sea before you could even sit for the exam. So there's an academic requirement and there was a practical app requirement that had to be completed before you could even take the exam. So one of the things that we used to say is it's 4 years of school in 3 years, because it is a 4 year curriculum, a 4 year matriculation track, just like any other college or any other service academy. But inside that, there is also 330 days at sea, or again, at least there was when I was there. I don't know if that requirement has changed. It's been a while, but so that was great. By the time I graduated college, I'd been to, I think, 19 countries. I'd
Okay.
spent a year on merchant ships, everything
Yeah.
from cargo ships to military sea lift ships. I was able to earn the Merchant Marine Expeditionary Medal, which is just being on a supply ship that crosses into waters in a declared war zone. So I was on a supply ship that went to Kuwait, and so that meets that criteria. As part of the curriculum or part of my experience at the Merchant Marine Academy, you had to do an internship, and I actually wound up doing two. The first internship was with a U.S. Army transportation unit out of Fort Eustis, Virginia, and I learned two things about myself from that program. One was that I didn't particularly care for the logistics career field, but I actually was, for somebody whose dream was actually to go to the Naval Academy, I found I actually had a really great time working in the Army, like working as a cadet shadowing a lieutenant. And I wound up having a great experience at that unit. Again, one of the nice benefits of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy is because it's not connected to a specific military service like the U.S. Military Academy or the U.S. Naval Academy or Air Force Academy. As a graduate of the Merchant Marine Academy, if you choose to go active duty, you actually have the option to assess into any of the branches that you choose. So at my graduation, I had classmates that went active duty Air Force, active duty Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Army, and it's really cool because at the graduation ceremony, you wear the dress uniform of whatever service you're going into. So you look out over the graduation event, and you can see, all the uniforms from all of the different services that cadets are assessing into. And so again, I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, didn't get in, got into the Merchant Marine Academy, and then wound up actually going from the Merchant Marine Academy into the Army. So certainly a path less traveled, I think.
Definitely. You don't hear too many people going to the Merchant Marine Academy, and most of the people who do become Merchant Marines go on to serve on ships. So that's a definitely a unique perspective, and you were able to find the niche that allowed you to serve our country, and I definitely thank you for that. So once you got into the Army, what did you do there?
So I commissioned as an armor officer, and one of the things that's really neat about the armor officer, or the armor career field for an officer, is that an armor officer can serve in a tank unit, a conventional armor unit, right? So Abrams tanks. You can serve in an armored reconnaissance unit, which is on the heavy side. You have Bradley fighting vehicles. You can serve as what they call light scouts. So in First Airborne divisions, they have cavalry units, and those guys use Humvees. Or you can serve like where I served is kind of, I guess I would say, like middleweight class with the Stryker fighting vehicle. So I went to a Stryker brigade. So even though my formal MOS is armor officer, I call myself a cavalry officer, because all my time in the Army was in a cavalry unit. I never served other than working with tanks in the officer basic course, which is kind of like your technical school for the armor career field.
Hmm.
Other than that, once I left there, I never worked in a unit that had actual tanks, like a heavy armor unit. So I consider myself a cab officer. That's again what I did for my entire time in. Like I said, I was in a striker unit out of Fort Lewis, Washington, and I generally had a pretty good experience. I started out as an assistant operations officer, as a young second lieutenant. Eventually took over a reconnaissance platoon. So I spent about 16 months as a reconnaissance platoon leader. Most of that time was in Iraq. Um, and then when I pinned captain, I became headquarters troop executive officer. And that was my last billet. I got out after that.
I have a friend who did kind of he would got to the point where they stuck him behind a desk as an army officer, and he says, "I'm out. I can't handle this desk duty."
That is pretty much what happened to me. I was having a blast as I would say, like a senior first lieutenant. We were in Iraq. I was a platoon leader. I had a armored reconnaissance platoon. We were doing some battlefield ISR type stuff. We even got to kind of do some crossover stuff with some human intelligence army units that were in the area. Our brigade had an MI company, as an organic asset. So I got to kind of dance that line a couple times between doing actual reconnaissance ISR and then doing some of the advise and assist missions. You know, training an Iraqi army counterpart unit to hopefully take over for us when we left. But as well as doing a little bit of the assisting on the intelligence side directly. And so I was having, like I said, I was having a blast. And then the day I pinned captain, I went to being a headquarters troop XO, and it was a hard e-break on all the fun.
Yeah.
And that work is necessary. And for the guys that stayed in and guys who work in like brigade staff and division staff level positions, like God bless those guys for sure. But for me personally, it was not a good fit. So I finished my service obligation, left active duty, and then I had mentioned earlier that when I was at the Merchant Marine Academy, I did two internships. So one was with that Army Transportation Unit. The other one was I actually worked at corporate headquarters for Blackwater back when it was still actually known as Blackwater. And they brought me on as an intern because at the time they were trying to stand up like a counter piracy division to that
Hmm.
business. And I would not use the word consultant because I don't think that as a Merchant Marine Academy midshipman I necessarily knew enough to consult, but I knew kind of just enough to help out a little bit, I guess. And so I spent a summer. Again, I didn't do anything overseas with them at that point, but I did work at corporate headquarters in a you know administrative type role, and again had a good experience there. Made some connections, kept in touch with some of those folks. So by the time I was getting ready to get out of the military, there were a couple people that I knew that were still there, and the company had changed names. And those people that are familiar with that story knows that's a bit of an entangled story. But that company changed names and changed ownership several times. But some of the
Yeah.
individuals that I had made friends with were still there, and so I wound up going back to what that company was eventually became known as. And now I think they're owned by Constellus Group right now. And so, but wound up going on a program, an overseas program with them at that point after I got out of the military. So I was in the Army for 4 years, and then I did another four as a contractor, uh, kind of just on that revolving door, 90/30, 90/30-ish day split, right? 60 to
Hmm.
90 days overseas, 30 to 45 at home, and just rinse and repeat for a couple of years, just on a, you know, security/force protection type program.
So when did you get start writing for the gun magazines?
Kind of in the middle.
Okay.
About the time I was getting ready to get out of the Army was about the time that I got my first request, my first offer to write a gun review, and that was for Guns and Ammo. And just to kind of stress how small of a world it is, it was actually an individual that I'd met as an intern at Blackwater who had left there and gone on to work as he is currently the editor in chief of Guns and Ammo. And when I got back from Iraq, I was starting to prep to ETS to separate from the military. Reconnected with somebody else who had also left BW and had wound up working with this. There were two people that had left BW and wound up at Guns and Ammo, and got home from Iraq. Just make a phone call, send an emails. Hey, I'm home. I was gone. I've been gone for a year. What did I miss? Kind of just reestablishing
Hmm.
connections. And that was in the course of one of those conversations was where I got the offer to like, hey, how would you like to take a stab at, writing an article? So I want to say it was probably around 2012. I wrote my very first freelance article for Guns and Ammo. I did 2 or 3 articles for Guns and Ammo, and then because it's all that work is freelance. So once I had a couple articles with G&A under my belt, I started branching out and working for other magazines, all in that sort of firearms tactical
Hmm.
type space, but multiple magazines, including Guns and Ammo. I mean, I stayed with Guns, as a freelance contributor for Guns and Ammo for several years while I was also working for, just doing freelance piecemeal work for other magazines as well. So I did that through most of my time as a contractor. I would I'd get on a plane. I'd disappear to Afghanistan for a couple months. I'd come home. I'd write 3, 4 articles in the month or so that I was home. I'd ship them out to the various editors, whatever magazines they were due for. And I'd get back on a plane and I'd go. And the next time I came home, those magazines would be on the newsstands, and I'd write another batch and ship them out, and then get back on the plane. And so that was part of how I built up my writing career, like actually on the professional side, doing magazine articles again from multiple magazines. And as time went on, I just sort of naturally gravitated towards maybe doing a little more work for Recoil magazine than I was doing for some of the other titles. And some of those titles unfortunately went out of business too, as well, over the course of that time. And Recoil was at a point where they were expanding. They were looking to add new titles to their portfolio. They needed more staff editors. So I was home from a deployment and was having lunch with the editor in chief of Recoil magazine. And he was talking about how busy he was. And I kind of half jokingly made a comment to the effect of like, well, when your workload gets too much and you need a helping hand, like I'd love to come over and work full time. And like I said, they just happened to be at a point where they were adding titles and they were growing the brand. And so I did. So I made the transition from contracting overseas. I came home from that uh, at the end of 2016, and then mid 2017, I started as a staff editor at Recoil magazine.
It's a fabulous story. So I mean, it's a lot of work too. You establishing your name and bringing that brand over of you. Now, are you looking to do the same kind of thing with your fiction writing, establishing the brand, really kind of pushing it out, or are you just kind of one every once in a while, and we'll see how it goes, or where are you at with that?
I think the reality is I'm still kind of trying to figure that out. I don't think that there's anybody who writes a book who doesn't at least once have they look at what we perceive as probably the dream, right? I want to make, you know,
Yeah,
a whole gob of money, and I want to write novels full time, and I want to quit my day job and move to the beach and sit in a lawn chair on my laptop while the surf laps at my toes, and I want to crank out bestseller after bestseller after bestseller, and type my way off into the sunset. Have I had those thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. But there's, A, that's such a small percentage of people, and B, there's a lot more that goes into that than sitting on the beach writing books, right? From a
yeah,
from a business
absolutely.
standpoint, a branding standpoint. I really like my day job right now. I really like remaining involved in the industry that I'm in, in the not just the firearms and tactical industry, but also in the sort of the media and communications portion of that space. I'm still a freelance contributor for a couple of gun magazines on the side, even with the day job that I have now. And I do that in addition to I am working on my second book. I had originally hoped that I would be done with that by the end of this year for like a Q1, Q2 next year, and I'm definitely behind schedule on that. So you know, I certainly I'm certainly not one and done. I am more than halfway through my second manuscript, and I'm probably 10% into my third manuscript. And, I have a story arc map that's hung up somewhere that I've got enough juice to go five, at least through the first 5, 6 books without batting an eye. Now, there's a whole big difference between having the arcs sketched out on a whiteboard and then sitting down and writing 80 to 100,000 words times 4, 5, 6 books while having a family and having a day job and also having other writing commitments that are even separate from your day job. So I'm kind of in a process where I'm still figuring that out. I did not go into fiction publishing with any illusion that I was going to quit my day job, out the gate on book number one, and that this was going to be the thing that puts food on my table. And at least right now, like frankly, that's actually not a position I think I really want to be in. Because again, even from the pragmatic standpoint of like, all right, cool, like I quit my day job and I'm a full-time novelist. Now I got to go get health benefits. Now I gotta, you gotta form an LLC and then pay
Yeah.
yourself out of that. And this is all stuff. This is all stuff that I know from having been doing security contracting, which is all 1099 work, and it's full-time 1099, and you're managing all of your finances. Most
Hmm.
guys do it through like an LLC or an S corp or something like that, just because it's easier and it's much more beneficial than just taking the money as an individual, right? But yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of this too. And again, like even when I was deploying overseas, shopping for at the time would have been when Obama was in office, right? And it was when that healthcare marketplace was still brand new, and man, some of those prices were through the roof. And so, I there's those are the kind of the first things I look at and go, well, like maybe I don't really want to just like maybe that's not like my short term goal. That like, yeah, I just want to, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I
So
want to throw it. I want to throw everything else to the wind and just write novels. But then there's also like a whole bunch of like very practical, unsexy, unglamorous, stress-inducing things that come with. Well, okay, now I'm basically self-employed and I have to treat this as if I'm running my own business. And like honestly, I kind of like how I have it where it is fiction writing commercially is like a component of sort of a portfolio of other things that I'm doing that I also really enjoy.
and that's the key is fitting it into what you enjoy because it is a full-time business. Once you go full-time, you have to treat it as a business and you have to wear all the different hats of marketing and advertising and uh, it is a lot. And if you're happy with where you're at, then congratulations. That is the goal. So as long as
Thank
we're
you.
going to keep seeing more work from you, as long as we're going to get this nice series rolling out eventually, because the more books you have, the more people are going to want to read through the series, and the more money you're going to make. I'm not going to say you're going to make $1 million next year, but the series is the big thing right now. So
Yeah, for sure. And certainly, that's not to say that I don't have the same, I don't have the same dreams that all the rest of us have as novelists. Like, yeah, I would
yeah,
love to see the series that is going to evolve from Close and Destroy. Like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I would love to see that crossover onto a screen of some
yeah,
kind, right? Um, there are things that I would love to be able to do from a content and storytelling standpoint outside of the novels themselves that frankly would be much more attainable if I had a larger commercial success. But in the meantime, I've got one book and pieces of a couple other manuscripts, right? So you probably see the same thing I do. Like you said, you kind of need to build up the body of work first. And so I'm kind of just in a point right now. As much as I would love, there's some other places commercially and financially that I would love to get to with fiction writing. I'm trying to just really focus on enjoying the process. I'm going to take, as if I haven't already for the last hour, but I am going to take a moment to shameless plug here. I was able to do a really cool project with a company called Colonel Blades. And so in the very opening sequence of Close and Destroy, there is a scene where one of my good guys kills a bad guy with a knife. He gets into an altercation that was supposed to start out as a gunfight, and it went real south real quick, and it gets up close and personal, and so he's got to dispatch a bad guy with a knife. In the opening pages of the book, the knife is described specifically as a knife called the contingency dagger. When I wrote that scene, the contingency dagger did not exist in real life. It was frankly a concept for a fighting or self-defense knife that I had in my mind. That, again, having worked in the space and done some of the things that I've done over the last few years, I've been able to work with a number of knife makers and review a number of blades. And there's some really great stuff out there, but there wasn't, I just wanted something specific. And so after the book was complete, I was able to get in touch with the ownership of, again, this company called Colonel Blades, and they have brought the contingency dagger to life. And so it is now a real knife that you can go to the Colonel Blades website and you can purchase the contingency dagger. And right now, every copy of the dagger comes with a signed copy of Close and Destroy as part of the package when you get the knife. And it's available single edge, double edge. It's super straightforward. It's a fixed blade knife. It's not a folder. Very straightforward design, but I am incredibly happy with how the team at Colonel Blades was able to take literally a napkin sketch that I took a picture of with my cell phone and texted to one of their design guys and basically said, I think that this is kind of how I see it in my head, but I don't know anything about knife making. And their lead designer was just absolutely awesome. And they actually sent me some 3D printed models of the knife, and I was able to like, hey, like, okay, I thought I wanted this, but I don't like how it feels in my hand. Can we tweak this? And we went through a couple of iterations. And so we landed on something, and that is for sale now. You can go to the Colonel Blades website. It's like I said, it's on sale now, and every knife comes with a free copy of the book that I've signed.
That's to me, in my mind, that is better than getting a book from Jack Carr with a bullet hole in it. So you get a knife to carry around.
And like I
My
said, it was super. Sorry, go.
No, I was just say we're gonna wrap it up because we're up against that hour mark. But so my last question to everybody is what as your readers you're reading your book, what do you want them to take away from it? What do you want them to what do you hope stays with them the longest after they've read the final page?
I would like them to understand the complexity of what happens in the world and what happens on the battlefield. For storytelling and entertainment purposes, we really strip out a lot of that, right? And again, for work that is sort of like lone hero driven, right? That's very sort of character based storytelling. And from an entertainment value, that's awesome. And again, as a consumer, like I love that stuff. But for me personally, with my background, it's part of the reason I went with an ensemble cast. It's part of the reason that I kind of like top down set piece style storytelling, because there is, having worked in, again, Iraq and Afghanistan, and participated in counterinsurgency, there's so much complexity, and there's so many layers to what makes those pieces move, right? I tried to capture elements of sort of the support network that goes into, whether they're contractors or special operators or whatever, right? Even conventional large scale infantry, armor, air units. We always talk about fighter pilots and special operators and all those guys, and a lot of storytelling. Again, for a number of reasons, there isn't usually a ton of emphasis put on the support role and all of the things that happen around your quote unquote action guys in
Mhm.
order to enable them to do their jobs. And so I tried really hard to capture some of that, and to capture that, like, those people working in an operations center or working behind a computer, or your research analysts or your intelligence analysts. I mean, those are people too. Those are characters. They have their own lives, their own storylines, if you will. So that's certainly part of it, but also some of the geopolitical complexities that go into that stuff. And good, bad, or indifferent, whatever anybody's thoughts are on who's right or wrong, or who's making things better and who's making things worse, regardless of what anybody's feelings is on that angle of it, at least understand that there are layers of complexity to it, that there are parts that interlock and that work together, that I a lot of times I think even if you're watching the news, I think a lot of that stuff gets lost.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely a deep point that you want people to carry away from it. So thank you very much for joining us on the show. And that's a wrap on this episode of Plot Recon, where thrillers get tactical. Thanks to Tom Marshall for joining me today. His debut novel, Close and Destroy, delivers the kind of authenticity that comes from years inside the firearms and security community, and it definitely shows. To follow Tom's work, check out his social pages and upcoming releases across the tactical and fiction space. And how do we get a knife, Tom?
You can go to colonelblades.com. That's Colonel like the Army rank, COLONEL, blades.com. And it's right there. They have this thing called the Operators Guild where they have SME, subject matter experts from around the tactical industry. They've given me an Operators Guild page. You can click on that. You can read a little bit about the story behind the knife, and you can order them right now.
Sweet. Check out his knife and get a free book, a signed copy of his book when you order a knife. So if this episode hit the mark, share it, leave a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. I'm Evan Graver. Thanks for listening. Stay sharp, write hard, and keep your fiction tactical.